Welcome everyone to this first anniversary. It was a year ago today that in desperation and just trying to figure out what was going on as people were kind of pulling back on things and things got weird, as you remember, that I decided to start this town hall. We had a Zoom account and I thought, okay, well, I don't know what to do, but let's pull in a bunch of people and talk about it and see if there's anything we can share and what we can do. And with that in mind, I knew the first person I wanted to invite and was able to get Brett to join us. And off we went. And so here we are a year later, and we have a lot of people who are regulars. To the best of our ability, for the regulars, we went ahead and sent you shirts. We do have extra shirts. We have 6 shirts. And so what we're going to do is Melissa's going to put her email in the chat, and the first 6 people that email, she'll get those shirts out to you. So if you go in a minute, she'll pop that in the chat. And if you email her, she's going to take the emails in order. So you may be punished by your email system, but she's going to bring those out. So let's move on to the next slide, Melissa, after you put your name in the chat there. And as I got started, I realized, wow, the first one had about 20, 30 people. And Tom, I remember, was one of the first ones, Jonathan Silly. There was a lot of folks who have kept coming and never stopped. And I thought, wow, if I'm going to keep this up, I need some help. And so there's only one person I know that I could call out of the blue besides Brett and say, hey, I'm doing this. Would you help me? And that was my good friend who I've traveled the world with, literally, Mike Lawson. And so Mike, of course, immediately agreed. He's always been an incredible help in our group. And here we are. And so then after that, we had people calling us and going, hey, we want to sponsor. And that went to the next level. And we were able to attract CUNA Councils, who has, I think, done a great job during the pandemic. GAC is something they put on. I just finished the tech committee a couple of weeks ago. So
yeah, marketing one's coming up in 2 weeks. So yeah.
Yep, coming up. Lending, is that what it is?
The CUNA Marketing and New Business Council, I believe it is.
That's right, CUNA Marketing and New
Business Development Council, yeah.
Yep. And then recently, and you'll notice if you got a shirt, their name's on here, Correlation. They really like this. And Jeff Dent is a really close friend, and the CTO over there called me and said, look, we want in. We like what you're doing. This is what we're about. As you can see, he's wearing his shirt and his hat. So he's a VIP. And he said, this is what our group's about. It's about collaboration, and we want to be involved. And so it was super awesome of him to reach out. And we're thankful to have Correlation as a sponsor. As I've said, I've known them for a long time. And, they're the premier, newest platform out there. And, we're excited to have them. Obviously, both Mike and I's parent companies, CU Broadcast and Best Innovation Group, sponsor this. And so here we are. So let's get into it. We've got these incredible guests. Here he is, the magic eyebrow. Brett, you could have been,
robot eyebrow.
Make their living using their eyebrows, like Jack Black.
I am an eyebrow model in my spare time.
Yes, I could see that. Brett, obviously futurist, international best-selling author 10 times over, and the host of the Breaking Banks podcast.
International Man of Mystery.
International Man of Mystery, which on the Breaking Banks podcast, I've been fortunate enough to be invited to that many times.
No, you've co-hosted it many times, yeah. Yeah,
good friend of Big, and has done just so much in the finance and for the finance world. So when Brett first came on, we did a little history here. So if we go to the next slide. So he was here August 5th. And about that time, the $600 extra unemployment payments had just ended. And we were talking about what the recession was. Brett, I think you correctly predicted the K style, I believe is what you were talking about at the time, and what that recovery would look like. I also remember just around those episodes, something kind of magical happened, which was there was a lot of fraud related to those unemployment payments and the stimulus checks that came in. And we had some conversations on here where others were able to share the footprint, the fingerprint of that fraud, and identify it and stop it at their credit unions. And folks like Jeff, who faithfully attended, said, hey, I think I could help my group with that, and took it back and wrote something to have everyone out. So, it was pretty cool. So that was the context of Brett joining us. And then after that, we were able to get another friend who's got his latest book, Doing Digital, Lessons from Leaders, a renowned financial expert, and someone who always, Brett's accent doesn't make me feel, as dumb as Chris's does. Chris always sounds brilliant. I've had the good fortune of being on some roundtables with him, and I always tell the joke of Chris starts sentences with like, I was speaking to the Emir of Abu Dhabi, and all my stuff starts with, I was talking to Jeff, who's from Alabama. And but funny enough, we both had the same point, and a brilliant commentator, someone who joined us, and we thank him for coming back today for this special episode. And so
I have to tell you that on daytime TV today, they have said that sex robots will automatically have British accents because it's far more attractive.
Really? Male sex robots or female sex robots?
They didn't classify the gender. I guess it's gender neutral.
Gender neutral robots. Got it. Okay. Well, I was not aware of that. But
that's definitely fake news.
It wouldn't be an Australian accent, I'll tell you that much.
How you going, mate? Wow. Sing.
And then when Chris joined us, we talked about what's next after digital. And one of the things we discussed was something that we were all experiencing at the time, which was this digital transformation being expedited, something we were all working on, something that was part of the Canadian space that suddenly became the most important thing in our world, mostly because the members made it that way. They forced us into it. And then after that, we were able to even get some more folks on. If you want to move to the next slide there, we were able to get Theodora Lau, and she's a Star Wars fan like me, which is very cool. I'll have to share another story with you, Theodora, about another Star Wars thing that I have downstairs. But public speaker, writer, advisor, and founder of Unconventional Ventures, talking about ecosystems for financial institutions, corporations, and startups. Interestingly enough, there's a lot going on right now with women and minority founders. One of the groups we'll have on here shortly is the Women of AI. And so there's Erica Lee leads a group that is really pushing for women in AI, which is, Theodora, I mentioned, put those two things together, but certainly in your wheelhouse. And when she joined us, we were talking about, I believe it was December, and we were talking about the longevity and the challenges of fintech and what really the experience we've been through has really meant for that. And so here we are, we brought them all three together. And, I want to ask now, with this great group that we have with us, what is kind of the next round, right? I feel like, and Brett, I'm going to throw this at you to lead off because Chris made fun of you. And so I think you deserve that. He did not make fun of Theo, so she'll go next. But
I can make fun of Theo if you like.
So Brett's coming to us from Thailand, and it's 2 a.m. and he was gracious enough to join us. So Brett, as you're looking at things, okay, we're looking around the world, and there's this sort of new normal, as this great reset is what it's being called. We've talked about it. Tom O'Shea and I have talked about it on a couple of different platforms, and so CEOs are trying to theoretically prepare for this great reset. Do you see that as a real thing? And what, in your mind, if it is real, what does it look like? Or what does this new normal look like as we begin to pull out, as people get the vaccines and can go back to their regular life?
It's not going to be the same as it was. I'm sure Theo's going to get into this as well, because it's part of her and Brad's new book, Beyond Good. But when you look at what is sort of awakening in the human spirit globally as a result of the pandemic, is a sort of resurgence of collectivism, that we're all in this together, humanity, and that we're tired of the division, and we've got to fix this. And some of the biggest challenges we've got coming up, the climate change issue, techno-based unemployment, the inequality issue that we have in the United States, and sort of the baggage that comes along with that. We are going to need to think differently about the future. There's some very big macro problems, capitalism has some tools to address those, but the fact that climate change is with us as a result of capitalism and rewarding fossil fuel companies, and so forth, despite them polluting and so forth, shows that it has some challenges to that. But if you look at what happened in the UK over the weekend with the protests, and maybe Chris can jump in and sort of talk about that, in terms of there was a young woman killed by a police officer, assaulted and then killed. When you look at those sort of protests, they are becoming fairly normal. In fact, over the last 20 years, the volume of protests, or the number of protests, has doubled, but the volume of participating protests around the world over the last 20 years has increased by 1,000% since the 1990s. So a lot more people are a lot more vocal about the economic uncertainty surrounding the pandemic and other things like that, and the fact that it has accentuated inequality, particularly in markets like the US and the UK and even Australia. But when you look at that collectively, and you look at millennials, the fact they've grown up a very digitally connected world, and with social networks, as part of it, we've got the next generation who's going to view all of this very differently. And so we're at a really important juncture in human history where, for the first time over the next 10 to 20 years, humanity is going to realign itself around a course of collective action for the species, which will go beyond nationalism and GDP economics and share prices in the stock market. And it's really interesting to be a part of this history and see this all unfolding. It's pretty interesting. So you got to see pandemic in context. It's part of it's forcing us to behave and think differently about our future.
Interesting. Yeah, so Chris, maybe since Brett threw it your way for the protests that happened out there, maybe fill us in.
Sure. And I'm in Poland, not in England, so
yeah.
Being clear, I'm not.
You're British.
Living in London.
You got the accent.
Yeah, you can tell from the accent. But there's kind of 5, maybe more major things happening that together are like tectonic plates. The first is digital transformation, which I've talked about for a long time, as you can tell from my backdrop. And it continues. And in 2020, most companies were forced to become digital, but most companies became digital in a token way that meant that they signed cloud contracts to become cloud-based, but then they didn't redesign their business to be cloud native. The second is that there's been this ongoing pressure that's been bubbling, particularly amongst millennials and Gen Z and iGen, around the climate emergency and the causes that people care about. The third is the huge inequality that's been demonstrably seen, particularly since 2008, between the 1% and the 99%. And one of the things that comes out of all of that, particularly because of the internet, is transparency. That means that people can see exactly how companies and individuals behave. And one of the interesting things about Black Lives Matter, or the murder of Sarah Everard, who was the British girl who was murdered in.
I know that story.
Yeah, I mean, she was murdered in Clapham Common and then taken to Kent in England, and her remains were left in a forest. Details to be announced later. And the shock of that was because it was a serving police officer who murdered her. It was caught very quickly. But again, track and trace of individuals now, particularly electronically, digitally, thanks to the devices that we own and the monitoring that's available through those devices, means that it's difficult these days to do anything that's not networked and reported. And that's as true for business as it is for individuals. So businesses that try and do things that are bad for the planet will start to lose business. And this is the reason why Jamie Dimon led the 2019 discussion around the Business Roundtable and stakeholder capitalism rather than shareholder capitalism, and the importance of serving all communities, not just the investors. So employees, staff, customers, and the community and the planet are just as important as the investors. Making that a demonstrable action is very difficult. I think businesses will be held to account for it. So I keep looking at Amazon and thinking it's amazing how successful they are, and at the same time, how completely incorrigible they are in the way in which they treat their people. I think eventually there will be a pushback against that, and there'll be a pushback against any business that treats people badly. And this is something that I'm now writing a lot about, in that my focus of my next iteration of writing is digital for good, which Theo and Brett and others are on board to support, and we'll be writing chapters for the next book. And it's all about basically that businesses, and particularly banks, have to be socially useful and have a purpose. And if you don't stand for something, you fall down. So what do you stand for? You know, what's actually the meaning of your company? What are you passionate about? And how can you share that with your staff and your customers to make that some differentiating factor, not just a marketing proposition?
It's interesting. A couple things occur to me based on what you're saying there. One is, I was just thinking this morning that it was interesting that Amazon came out in favor of, here in the United States, the $15 pay raise, or nominal pay, because the first thing I thought was, well, if Amazon's for it, maybe it's not good, because like, especially if you're a smaller business. So I thought that's a fascinating comment.
Well, also just on that one, John, that there was a really interesting headline that Amazon uses gamification in their plants to make people work harder.
Yep.
They're not paying them more, but they're making them have more fun and games without realizing that actually you're working harder and not getting paid for it.
Yeah, there absolutely was that, and they are all over that sort of thing. We were even looking into that from a grading perspective with some tools that were out there, and I think you're going to see more of that as the workforce continues to evolve. But yeah, I want to come back to there's a theme going on here that I think is fascinating that I want to come back to around this idea of acting ethically within the environment and what we have, and I think AI is going to play a role in that. So I want to come back to that. But let's go on to Theo.
Sorry, John, just before we jump to Theo, because I know this will be in line, but I don't know if you saw Bill Gates's, he's got a new book out on climate, how we address that. But one of the things he says is, as industrial nations that led carbon output, we are going to have to carry a greater share of responsibility for things like climate refugees that are created by the pollution we created. And I think that's the ethical position. But I think, as a policy position, that's going to be pretty politically untenable.
Yeah, and the worry I have is as carbon positions become a currency, which is going to happen. It's already happened in most of the majority of the world, but we here in the United States still fight that off in terms of, you can't make a mattress in Brazil unless you have enough carbon credits to offset the creation of that mattress. So it's very interesting how that's all going to play out and what it means to the banking system, because it changes our perspective on what currency is. It changes our perspective on what holds value. And I think, what Chris was just saying, what do you stand for if you stand for anything? And that does relate to our values. And it's something that's always been a big part of the credit union industry. And what I'm excited about is I know that this is another area where I feel like we could win as credit unions in that space. So, but yeah, let's jump to Theo. So Theo, I said you'd go second, and then I tricked you, and Brett tricked us into having Chris be second.
That's all right. I think they have more interesting to say anyway all the time, right? And
No.
Chris, thanks for the robot comment. That's the second time I hear it. So yes. Hey John, thanks for having me back.
Oh no, a pleasure. Thanks for being here. So yeah, talking a little bit about kind of, commenting on what Chris and Brett were bringing up, and they both kind of threw it your way in terms of ethics and behavior and doing good with digital. And I know that's a passion for you and your group. So how do you see that unfolding for the organizations, and how does that play into the consumer's desire to be a part of that? Because I feel like that's what they're looking for, is to be part of something.
Well, that is a loaded question. How much time do you have? I think at the end of the day, right, it goes back to what both Brett and Chris started off with, is where do we sit right now, 2021, a year and a few months after the start of the pandemic. I would say for a lot of people, we are not getting any better than how we were. For women, we're much worse off than we were before. 1 in 4 women are thinking about leaving the workforce. 1 in 3 that left in the summer, they left because they had to take care of children, right? So if you think about inequality, you think about the millionaires who did pretty well and recovered, more than enough recovered. And then you think about, well, what about the rest of us? What about the rest of the people? And then you start thinking about, what role does financial services play in bringing them back, in rebuilding better? And it leads me to a visual, and I use this a lot because it stuck with me. This was pre-pandemic. It was from a report that I read that says, imagine if everyone were to sit on their own wealth piled up in $100 bills, right? Just imagine that visual, a pile of $100 bills. A middle-class person from a rich country would be at the height of a chair. The world's 2 richest men would be sitting in the outer space. Now, this is pre-COVID, right? And we all saw the curves post-COVID or during COVID right now on how far we have gotten. And talking about Amazon, Chris, there was an analysis being done a couple months ago that says if Jeff Bezos were to give $100,000 to each of his workers, he would have had still the same wealth as he did back in March of last year. He wouldn't have lost a dime, right? So think about how we have gotten from March last year to now, 1 year. And think about where we are right now, where we still see people struggling, where, yes, of course, we can talk about all the stimulus money that's coming, but where are they going? Also, the people, they're not saving them. They're using them to pay bills so they don't get kicked out. They're using them to pay off their debt. So the question comes back to, how do we respond to that? And I would argue that the solution is not to provide them yet another loan. If you're in debt, don't go look for debt consolidation solution. We as an industry, doesn't matter how big and small you are, we have a responsibility to help people get back to health.
Yeah, it's something you said kind of I find fascinating, is this idea that as we move towards this labor workforce as a resource, right? And you were kind of you were alluding to that. One of the things I think has also happened is we've learned that the concept of supply and demand as it relates to the workforce doesn't necessarily apply, right? And I think you just made a very good point where we could raise the minimum pay to $15, and theoretically, if you follow the rules of supply and demand, well, then it's going to make the workforce less available, or have that effect where they're not hiring as much. But reality is that there's so much profit at the top to be dispersed, which is kind of what you were saying around Brett, or around Jeff and Brett. We know he needs to disperse his profit as well. But
I think the argument is that I'm not asking for people to be like, all going nonprofit. We understand profit is important, right? We all understand the lights need to be kept on. But then the question is, how much is enough?
Yeah, and that's exactly it. And I think that's where there's some interesting concepts, because it's not against capitalism as much as it's around the idea that if you create a divide that's so wide that eventually uh, every time in history we've created that divide that's gotten to a certain point, it's led to, going all the way, circling back to Brett's beginning comments, more unrest and more civil unrest, and then eventually a revolution of some sort.
Yeah.
But
Will Durant, Lessons of History, said exactly the same thing. But there's some really interesting piece about supply and demand in particular, is that we're seeing the detachment of labor participation from the supply and demand curve because of automation.
right.
And so as you ramp up automation, what happens is you can create supply of product and services with automation that doesn't require labor participation to increase. And that's when you look at the most valuable companies in the world today, they're all technology companies. And as Chris and I have written multiple times on this, the difference there is that the profit per employee is 10, 20 times what it is in a conventional organization. And so as you get very high automation, high technology companies forming the basis of your economy, it results in lower labor participation. And so unless you've got sort of a counterbalance to that, something like universal basic income, or you put the demand on corporates to fix that problem, then over time, you're just going to get less and less people participating in the workforce. That's the mechanism by which technology and automation is going to disrupt employment significantly globally, but certainly in the United States.
Well, the other result,
I wasn't sure which way this conversation was going to go, but whilst we're talking about this, it's quite categorically clear, particularly in the last year during the pandemic and lockdown, that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And so I was writing about the Bloomberg article saying there's a $3 trillion bounce back about to happen of consumer spending. And I'm going, who's got the $3 trillion? There's been a lot of savings piled up in the last year, but those savings have been piled up by those who have been furloughed or working from home and have no impact on their income or their wealth, versus the people who lost their jobs, who are generally, I guess, working in muck jobs, jobs that weren't essential, that could be easily displaced. And, the gig economy, the people who self-employed contractors, and they're suffering immensely right now. And I think that divide is actually going to Brett's opening statement, and you picked up John and Theo on it, is going to create huge civil unrest unless it's addressed. And it's not necessarily, universal basic income, that solves everything. More to do with how can we create a more equal society that's more inclusive? And that's where we have the biggest challenge. How do we create a more inclusive, equal society that actually spreads the wealth and doesn't concentrate the wealth?
Yeah, and to your point, and Brett's point on the supply and demand, the supply side, if people don't make money to afford to buy your expensive things, then eventually that breaks that model as well.
So the United States post-Second World War, from the years 1950 to 1970, is the most successful economy the world has ever seen. Phenomenally successful in terms of production, in terms of productivity gains, in terms of net household wealth gains, in terms of wage increases, in terms of savings increases, you name it. The post-Second World War US economy was an absolute machine. But part of that was you had a very even wealth distribution curve. It followed the bell curve. And so you had broad market participation by everyone in the economy. That's where the housing boom came from. That's where the tronics boom came from. That's where, the impetus behind computing and so forth came from the wealth that was in society. But in the 1980s, we see both in the UK and the US an effort to limit collective bargaining with more pressure on trade unions. We see the deregulation of the financial services market, and guess what happens? That bell curve starts to shift to the right. We see wealth going to the 1% more, and so after 40 years of no real, well, it's not just Reaganomics. Clinton obviously, was the one that deregulated the financial services industry. So you could say it's neo-feudalism or the elite gaming the system, which is what Will Durant, in Lessons of History, when talking about revolution, John, that's what he warned us. He said that's what happens is you have a diamond-shaped economies, with that bell curve of distribution are phenomenal, but they're unstable because the elite tend to game the system, and we see that, with the inequality that Chris is talking about. That's very clear. And so if we don't figure out a way to create consumption at the grassroots level in an environment where employment opportunities are decreasing, then we got a challenge, which is a pretty good argument for UBI.
Yeah, and I'll shut up in a minute. But if you watch any science fiction, or even fact, then where you have huge divisiveness of the mass of society being unequal to the rich of society, you end up with revolutions. And Metropolis, the 1927 film by Fritz Lang, typified that point. I'm a huge fan of that film. But since then, you almost watch anything like Hunger Games or any other entertainment, and it's all about the masses being suppressed by the wealthy, and it's not sustainable.
Well, I'll add to it too. Along with that, in addition, is we all know what we have seen what's happening in China and Japan, right? A lot of the Asian countries where people are getting older. And so when we're thinking about automation, we think about the, using technology to do work. How many people do you actually need to keep the country productive, right? How do you keep the GDP up? And I think we're seeing that challenge in Japan is, they invest a lot in robotics and automation because they don't have enough people to work. So there is that challenge too.
So and because they don't have a big immigration policy, because immigration is one of the ways to offset shrinking birth rate, so you get continued economic growth.
Right, which was part of the story of that most successful.
That's why Brett is in Thailand.
Because of the birth rate.
I thought it's because he has a nice backdrop. That's why.
Yeah,
it's the only place that would let him in.
Yeah.
He's got to get rid of the monitor tan somehow,
So I want to take this thought, and this inequality is a theme, and so I want to keep it moving in that regard. So there are a lot of Crayons on here, and I'm going to pick on one of my really close friends, Tom Shea, who is planning for this year. He's had to sort of rethink 2021. He couldn't basically put a full plan together. And I know one of the things that's really heavy on his mind, because we've had this discussion, is AI. And so one of the things that I have concerns around is, the first most obvious use case of AI, in my opinion, is lending. We're already seeing that start to permeate the market. We're seeing, lots of so-called and some real, some not, some more machine learning as opposed to real AI or general AI, as you and I would describe it. But do you guys, as we move into this, how do we prevent the AI from doing its obvious job? Because if it's truly going to be AI, it's going to look out in the market. And in some ways, I have a worry that it could make that inequity worse. So, and Brett, I know you've written a lot about this. Maybe we'll start with you. But as I look at the technology transformation, the number one thing I think that's got to happen is, the game changer, the revolutionary technology is going to be becoming a proactive financial institution, such that you are acting on behalf or as an agency of the member in a way. And the AI is what's going to lead us in that direction. So maybe speak to that a little bit. And
so now we're in the fintech domain finally. So one of the interesting elements of, and I don't know if many CU people understand this. I don't think many bankers around the world generally understand it. But if you take all of the mobile wallets globally and aggregate their traffic during 2020, and you compare that globally to all the plastic cards in the world in use for banking, credit cards, debit cards, general purpose reloadable cards, gift cards, etc., payroll cards. If you compare that, then mobile wallets outpaced debit cards and plastic cards in general, almost 2.5 times to 1. in 2020 in terms of both the volume of transactions overall and the aggregate value of transactions. And so I guess not many bankers realize that the main form of day-to-day credit today is, or day-to-day payments and money management is not a bank account, but it's a mobile wallet. And so by the end of this decade, you're going to have something like 2.5 billion people who their sole contact with banking utility is through a mobile wallet, and they will have never had a bank account. And so that's a sea change. It's a huge leap forward in tech. But now we get to where the AI fits in. As you start to use mobile wallets for day-to-day payments, you can now do a whole bunch of other stuff you can't do with a plastic card. I can contextualize your payments. I can coach you on financial wellness. I can give you access to credit contextually based on a geolocation trigger or a behavioral trigger. There's so much more flexibility that platform gives me. It can be integrated into browsers where I'm doing my shopping. It can be integrated into payroll experience. Into payment experiences like buy now, pay later, like Affirm and Klarna and so forth. All of that is what I would classify as the smart bank account wars. So that as AI starts to be integrated into day-to-day banking, essentially how smart your bank account is, and coming again off the back of COVID, how it helps you save money, not how it helps you spend money, which has been the focus of the last 30 years with plastic cards, airline miles and cashback rewards. The focus is going to switch because of the economic uncertainty and the economic effects of COVID to a bank account that helps you save money actively. And so that's really what I see over the next 5 years, the differentiation between one bank and another being emphasized through the smart wallet tech. So that's why we see companies now partnering with Google and others, and we see PayPal doing so well. It's all part of this sort of shift to, a smart tool for your day-to-day discretionary spend.
So that smart wallet, the interesting thing is, and I'm gonna at some point I'd love to get all three of you back on to discuss this, but it's a whole nother show, is DeFi. So I've been doing a lot of work in DeFi, and a lot of that wealth creation. I think savings is important, but I also think that as investment, and you look at back to that class sort of warfare that Chris was talking about, and I'll throw this at Chris. Wall Street bets is an example of that shift. About Chris feeling like that Reddit community is one of them in a way, where Chris froze for a second, so I was worried I was going to keep talking until he unfroze. But do you think that there's some premise around that as well, as people turn to these alternate ways of funding wallets and making wealth?
Well, again, going back to what I said in my opening, there's a number of tectonic plates shifting right now because of the internet, and the key is there is transparency. There's a democratization of connectivity. People can deal directly one-on-one, and that's the reason why everyone is a little bit concerned about cryptocurrencies, and particularly Bitcoin. But it's equally why Bitcoin has seen such a massive shift and rise over the last year, because a lot of people, and even now institutions and treasury operations, are seeing cryptocurrency as a hedge against the instability of governments and the economies that they're living in. And this is a trend that will continue. And alongside this, going to the artificial intelligence question, I think it's really interesting that most of the banks that I deal with and credit unions are using technology to deal with traditional products and services and risk. So they use AI, for example, to look at exposures and potential credit risk, rather than for intelligent marketing and service. And customer intelligent marketing and service is going to be the critical differentiation over the next decade. And I've said it regularly because I've dealt with this for so long, that too many institutions, big and small, have fragmented customer data. They just don't have a good view of the customer. They don't know the customer well enough through the data that they have about the customer. And whilst they deal with the customer that way, the customer will eventually walk, because there are companies that do deal with them really well with their data. And we know who those companies are. They're the Amazons, the Facebooks, the Googles of this world. And none of those are going to get into banking. But what they're going to do is they're going to get into banking through big banks. Mm-hmm. And they're doing that. You know, the tie-ups between the Amazons, Facebooks, and Googles, with the JP Morgan Chases and Bank of Americas and you know the Wells Fargos of this world will start to become critical partnerships that will threaten a lot of activities for the banks that are specifically the banks that are too small to be big but too big to be small. You know, the mid-range regional banks are going to feel a huge squeeze because they don't use customer data well, they don't clearly state their purpose and values well, they don't have the tie-ups with big tech companies, they don't have anything basically.
That is such a great statement. I just wrote that down. That should be your next book. Too small to be big and too big to be small by Chris Skinner. Because it really does resonate. I do agree. I think there's that middle ground where they understand. And that's what I was alluding to earlier with the question about artificial intelligence is as it's used more to mitigate risk, to forecast, to do those sorts of things. It seems like it will inevitably sort of come up with the answer that it should come up with, which is the rich get richer because they're the ones you're going to want to make loans to. And every credit union on this call right now, they're trying to figure out how to make more loans. That's their biggest issue. They're diversifying into these other asset classes because, as we've seen, we're not seeing that bounce back. And so let me just throw this at Theo then. So, and it's an all play here, but I think Theo would get it as well. So Theo, I think you and I talked about this last time, but in the post 1918, so 1918 pandemic hits, and then we have the roaring 20s, right? And after that, we have the Great Depression. I actually interviewed my grandparents about this because I was sitting around one day and my grandmother made me a sandwich, and when she was done, she put it in tinfoil. When we got where we were going, I tried to throw the tinfoil away after I ate the sandwich, and she said, "Hey, where are you going?" And I said, "I was going to put this in the garbage." And she said, "Nope." And she flattened it out, took it home, cleaned it, put it back in the drawer. And after talking to my mom about it, she said, "Oh yeah, you don't throw that stuff away around grandma, because it's post-depression behavior from a time when they literally had nothing in the Dust Bowl, those sorts of things in the middle, the Midwest here in the United States." So the question is, as we move towards this, what's different now? And you alluded to this earlier, Chris, in saying, well, who has this $3 trillion of pent up spend? Where's that coming from? I think it's mostly vacation and travel, if you ask me, and that's again sort of swayed to the rich, if you will. But the question I have is, what's to keep that from repeating? Like, do we see that is that not we talked about history repeating itself. Do we not see that as a model that could also repeat?
Yep, history does rhyme, doesn't it? 74% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. So I would take a bet that extra whatever $1 trillion and not resting with them, right? Mm-hmm. They're resting with the people that can afford to stay home during the pandemic, not the ones that are out working. They are resting with the people that can afford to be online, like all of us right now, not those who cannot afford to be online. They are not resting with the 17 million children in their households who could not connect to schools, and they lost a whole year. So I think...
Not to mention the 1.5 million children that were made homeless during the pandemic.
Yes, and 50 million Americans that are food insecure right now. 50. This is the richest country of the world, and I would argue
that's 1/3 of the U.S. adult population, right?
Yes,
right around there.
And these figures should make us cringe. If you don't cringe right now, there's no hope for this country. I'll just say it out loud, right? Yeah. It will keep repeating itself because if we don't stop and pause and think about what we're doing, because we all have a role in it. We keep saying that we all have a role in it. If you're in the business of lending money, think about what you're lending. If you're in the business of having a third of your revenue coming from fees, think about what fees you're collecting from what people and why, right? Go back to your business model. What are you doing? Because you play a part in this. We all do.
So here's the question. Here's the question, which I know you have a view, Theo and Brett. Why are
we have an opinion.
Why are the governments not sorting this out? We're very aware, acutely aware of inequality that's been exacerbated in the last year. And yet, when I look at governments around the world, not just the USA, I have this, sickening feeling, going to what you were saying about cringe making, that governments are not addressing the core issues of how to make society more inclusive and more equal. And as a result, on the trickle-down effect, banks and the financial system do not focus on making society more inclusive and more equal.
Look at who's in power, right? It always goes back to who has the power, who has the money, who has the power. So, Marissa and I and Brad had a conversation about this recently. You look around the people that are sitting on the board, right? You look around the people that are in Congress. You look around the people that draft the laws. We talk about why it is so unequal for women. We talk about why the pandemic has been such a hardship for working mothers, is because we don't have enough lawmakers that understand what challenges we run into when we are being asked to take care of your kids. Oh, at the same time, you're supposed to be present for your work, right? I feel that. And I am not even have to worry about, the roof, because I have a roof, I have a functioning gigabyte internet that I'm drinking from every day. I don't have to worry about a lot of the things that people do, but I feel the pain from March of last year to now. Every day I sleep for 4 hours because I spend 6 hours with my kids during the day when they do virtual school. I start my work when they get done and I work until 3:00 in the morning. So that's me. I'm running a business, we're doing stuff. Think about all the other women who do not have that option, right? And so unless we talk a lot about diversity, but it's not just about diversity in gender, isn't it? It's about diversity of people from different backgrounds who understand what things people are going through. It's about diversity of people from different education systems, diversity of people with different abilities or disabilities, and all of those, they all play a role. So until we all have the ability to speak up, not just have a seat and table, but also have a mic in front of us, we're not going to solve anything.
So I like something you said a minute ago. You said we all have a part in this. And so, again, we have tons of leaders of Canadians on this line, represented from all across the country. So, Brett, I get your point, and Chris, I think you're there. I think the smart wallet, the smart account, I actually call it autonomous banking. That's kind of my thought for it, is this idea of self-driving banking. But what products and services can we do to help with this? Because that's what Canadians were created for, and we've talked a lot about the underserved. So Theo, kind of back to your question there, is should Tom be working on the single mom loan system? And also, does that really reflect the country in its future state? Like, for example, with gig working being something that's available, does that become a new future? And how do you deal with that from a traditional banking experience where Tom needs to see your paychecks and all of those things to make you a loan? So I know I've thrown a lot.
I think there's some more fundamental questions than that. I think the fundamental question we have to ask ourselves right now, given that we see all these problems, we see the pandemic, we see how problematic it was for humanity, more so for Americans than any other country in the world to some extent. And we see the potential problems around climate. We see employment patterns changing and all of this. And, we have to say, there's got to be a better system, right? Now, the problem when you come and look at something like capitalism and you start thinking about trying to change capitalism, there's a lot of vested interests that say, no, this is the best system we've got. But if you're a futurist like me or Katie, and you're looking out 1,000 years or 2,000 years in the future, do we really think that our current form of capitalism will be the best that we can possibly come up with, or that our model of democracy will still have survived in 2,000 years? History teaches us that that's not going to happen. And so once you allow yourself to say, we're going to find a better way, then you can start looking for that better way. And the problem we've got is the fundamental nature of what our economy is. What should the economy do for its citizens? And first and foremost, there's a fairly strong argument to say, first and foremost, you shouldn't have inequality. You shouldn't have education issues. You shouldn't have healthcare issues. That the economy, first and foremost, should look after its citizens. And that includes making sure we have a future for our grandchildren. And once that's done, then you can start doing the consumption and the consumerism and the capitalism and all of that. But what is the economy for if it's not there to cater for the basic needs of citizens? I think that's the fundamental question that sort of keeps coming back to us at the moment.
Yeah, and I think I'll build on that, because there's a couple of things that clearly struck me over the past year. One is, I predicted in the 1990s that we'd see a huge growth of boutique banking, and we haven't. And the reason why I predicted that is that back in the 1990s, we had the Gay and Lesbian Bank, we had David Bowie Bank, we had banks on the internet that were forming for niche or niche, depending on your accent, communities. And I truly believe that that's still a very valid proposition. It's called community banking, and building banks for communities that are now online, that are digital, that you want to reach. And that's a huge untapped opportunity today, 30 years later, 25 years later, that I think is still there, that there are niche communities that you can reach out to and build specific offers, not based on existing products and services, but based on new products and services specifically for that community, that aren't based around gender bias or ethnic bias or color bias. And I wrote the other day on a blog, and this struck me really well, because when I wrote it, I was suddenly thinking, geez, this is a workshop. If you're building a financial service to deal with people living on Mars, what would you build? And the reason why that's an important question is, A, yes, we're going to live on Mars sometime in this century, probably, if Elon Musk delivers his dreams. But B, that's actually what we're dealing with right now during lockdown. The customers effectively on Mars, they're not coming into branches, they're not coming into stores, they're stuck at home, they're working from home, they're serviced from home, they're entertained from home, they're not going out. So if you're building a business model for a customer living on Mars, effectively that's a business model that you should build right now for the customers living on Earth.
It's funny. I can hear Brett right now going, but they're 2 souls away, and you're going to have to deal with the fact that it's 10 days out. And we had this discussion on a sci-fi podcast we did together.
I brought in 2 tickets on SpaceX.
Customers are from Mars, bankers are from Venus.
Hey, Chris, you said something interesting. You mentioned all these biases. Do you think there's income bias? I mean, isn't that kind of what lending is in a way?
Well, I spent a lot of time talking to people who are working across the African nations, particularly Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa. And, what's interesting there is I'll tell you a very quick story, and then Theo and Brett chime in. I went to Ethiopia a couple of years ago, and I had all sorts of bias in my head about what the nation was like and the people were like, because of my upbringing and my perceptions in the media of Ethiopia. I was blown away, because they are dirt poor but family rich. They're the happiest people I've ever met. They're the most welcoming people I've ever met. They didn't need a dollar because they've got their kids and their uncles and aunts and everyone around. And I think we lost something, and it's something that, again, I'm bringing back into my discussion around purpose. If you don't stand for something, you're for. is that the Milton Friedman economic capitalist view of the world is completely gone. It's completely, dismantled. And yet I don't think a lot of people, particularly Americans, have realized this yet, which is you're not here to just make money and profit. You're here to have a life. Africans understand that. And that's what you experience in the African nations in the way they're building financial services. It's not about making money. It's not about being, in a big mansion. It's about having a happy life, but being included in the network so you can actually transact without being punished. The worst thing right now, to be honest, is that most of the poorest people in the world are punished for being poor because they pay the most for transactions. They pay the most for credit. That's disgusting in the 21st century.
Well, that is the definition of income bias in a way. I mean, when you put it like that. Theo, did you want to respond to that?
If you go back, back in U.S. history, right? You started with redlining. That's where everything started, right? And I would
with what? Say it again. With what?
Redlining with the housing, right?
Okay.
So I would say, throughout the past, I don't know how many years, 40, 50 years, we haven't changed that. Have we fixed it? We have not, right? Because all of the challenges and all the inequalities, if you will, that stemmed from policy and stemmed from how banks responded to it, we have inherited it and more, right? And so apart from, I think, was it Chicago or somewhere that they tried to, go back and fix the problem and, and reach out to the communities that were hurt. Other than that, we have seen everything that inherited. The US has the highest economic immobility for all of the developed nations. We have the worst, right? If you're born in a certain zip code, the chances are you're going to stay in that zip code. Chances are you are exposed to opportunities that are far more limited to everyone else that have, exposure to different schools, different people, and different opportunities and experiences. So what I do hope is that, trying to end with a happier note, since it's very upsetting, I'm hoping that COVID, if anything, has taught us a little bit of empathy, has taught us a little bit about how to think about people that don't have it. And hopefully with the trends about hybrid working, about people moving back with their parents, I read some stat about a lot of the younger generation, they move back with their parents, right, to their hometown. That will somehow create a more equal distribution of talent, that you can help develop local communities and bring the talent in and help equalize that, right? And then that is the job of community banks and credit unions to figure out how you can develop solutions that can help these entrepreneurs and small businesses prosper. That's the one hope I have.
I was talking to Crystal Long from GECU. She has her credit unions down in El Paso along the border there, and she has a very mixed group of people. And she said, hey, we're burning the boats. When I asked her what the future holds, and it was a reference to Cortez, and I thought she meant burning down their branches, which I knew would make Brett happy, but that's not what she meant. She meant we're not going back this other way. And she said, but we're not sure. We just built a corporate office that has all this space. And first thing I said was, turn it into a makerspace. I don't know if anybody knows what a makerspace is. I have a makerspace here. I love it. It's all the 3D printing and everything. You pay $20, $30 a month to be part of it. You can go down there and print, build, learn from other people, take classes, do 3D classes. And I think credit unions should get involved in that. We used to be a vocation type organization. So I want to
create spaces for kids to do remote education.
Yeah, why not? Why not? Safe spaces.
Wi-Fi, right?
Yeah, use your corporate office as something useful and use it for the community. So we scheduled this a little longer because we knew all of you were going to attract a lot of people. And traditionally, one of the hallmarks of this show is that I'm not the only one that talks, and neither are you guys. I'd like to take this next 10 or 15, if you guys can stick around for a minute or two, and Brett, I know it's late where you are, and get some questions from the group. And I'm going to throw it to my always has a question and always a way to break the ice, Tom, and then probably Jonathan after that. So go ahead, Tom.
Well, hi, everyone. Really, really good to talk to you all again.
And Tom, remind them of your credit. We got a lot of
Tom O'Shea. I'm with the Aspire Federal Credit Union in
and you're a regular. That's why you have your shirt.
And this is important because I put my blue T-shirt over my Irish green polo
Yes,
shirt.
on St. Pat's Day. Yes, I agree.
Right. But I think one of the things that we've sort of touched on through this conversation that I think is something that needs to be addressed is education. You know, the education systems in many ways are failing the students. They're not training the students for future jobs. College value for the price is just so out of whack. If we don't fix that aspect, we're never going to see an income inequality. You're forcing people to stay in that zip code, like Theo's
Absolutely,
talked about.
Tom.
You know, you're not going to be able to get any level of income inequality if we don't address that particular issue. So how does that look in, you know, from a foundational point of you know, a need within the economies?
So let me tackle that initially, and then I know Chris is going to jump in. You know, the one thing that you see the role of education, obviously, you know, you'll hear Jack Ma and others talk about this, that our current education system was built to create factory workers, factory drones. You know, you sit in your classroom, you listen to the instructions, you follow the instructions, you go to the next station on the production line. That's essentially how it was designed. It's not designed for the 21st century, where there are going to be massive jobs created are with strong technical competencies and things like that. And as you've pointed out, access to STEM is optional right now, based on how much money you have. It's not a core competency that the schools are teaching at a level that would enable you to go into the technology workforce. And so there's going to be a big change there. Also, we're finding that if you want to differentiate humans from robots in the future, then it's the empathy, the emotion, you know, the human elements that we really want to emphasize. Jack Ma says it's putting love back into education. But, you know, if you look at Finland and Norway and the Nordics who are experimenting with this at the moment, you know, you see they let their kids play for hours and they do application of learning through play and things like that. There's many ways we could be far more effective, but the minimum requirement to get people financially mobile is giving them that education. And so whether that is through you know, broad corporate sponsorships of education, we're starting to see the likes of Google and others create their own funnels instead of universities now that are alternatives. So you can do a course for $300 with Google and potentially get a job with them through Coursera, but Google sponsored. They will even pay for the training. So there are elements where corporates are recognizing this, that the current system isn't working in, but it's that sort of, you know, middle school and primary school stuff where we currently lack the infrastructure from a subject and domain expertise to get our kids ready for that next level, and also to make them socially or financially mobile, to be able to do more technical careers that pay better and things like that, then get them out of the zip code, as you say. So the first thing, you know, if you see what Ray Dalio says, first thing you do, you know, he's one of the most successful billionaire hedge fund managers in the world. He said the first thing we'd do if I was president is I'd make all education free in the country, because that's the best way you mobilize your economy. That's the best way you create you know, future success. But it's the right type of education as well. We would have to change that.
Well, I'll extend that though too. It's not just about the education is important, but also how you are defining who you want to hire, right? So if you keep saying, well, I will take an entry level, you know, someone applying, but you must have a 4-year degree from a, you know, XYZ college, you're never going to fix it. If you hire it based on, I need all of these lists of qualifications, which basically shut out half of the population, you'll not get that either, right? So education and changing how we're teaching kids is important, but I will also put the burden on corporations on how they're thinking about hiring and who they're hiring.
Yeah, and I could build on those points, but I'm surprised that Brett missed the opportunity to plug Moven Financial Wellness, in that
He knew
the
you would
core
do it.
point. Well, you know, but the core point here is that I've realized over the last few years that the most successful fintech companies are not trying to compete with banks, but they're serving the people that banks don't serve well. You know, you look at Stripe, valuation of 95 billion, which is 3 times more than last year. And And it's because they're serving small businesses, particularly in merchants online, in a way in which banks don't serve well. And when you look at actually the most successful companies like PayPal or Stripe or Adyen or Klarna, they're all creating markets that banks didn't serve well. Small businesses, consumers who didn't want to do online checkout with a bank account because they were worried about their bank being hacked. But more than that, it's serving markets that weren't served well and serving markets that weren't served at all. And so when you look at the African nations or Nubank in Brazil, they're serving customers that the banks overlooked. I distinctly still remember at a conference, someone said to me, why is it that banks think that financial inclusion is charity? It's not charity, it's profitable. WeBank in China is profitable after the first 12 months of operation. It's serving customers for less than $50 a year in terms of administering their accounts. And their target is blue collar workers. They grew from nothing.
They made almost 500 million in profit last year.
Yeah, and they grew 200 million customers in less than 2 years. And it's kind of like the fact that because of digital inclusion and digital for good, that we should focus far more on financial wellness, financial literacy, financial education, and financial support of the customer rather than profit from the customer.
Yeah, first of all, I want to say you are full of sound bites. My goodness. Financial inclusion is not charity. Write that one down, Brett. That's another book. I want to build on a couple of those points. One, I absolutely agree that I look at education and today you can learn anything you want to learn on YouTube. If you want to, I don't know, whatever it is you want to do, there's not just one video on it. There's 23,000 videos and 3 of them are done by sock puppets. The other day, and this is gross, but take it or leave it, I needed to fix something in the house and I looked up the video to do it. And there's a whole group of, I guess, women who decided to work from home, attractive women who've decided we could build a channel out of not wearing much, but showing you how we're good at building your house. Had to get rid of that channel. It didn't set well with my wife. But point is that no one's going to acknowledge.
Sounds like an
my
excellent
YouTube.
Idea.
Yeah.
I'm seeing a trend in here, gentlemen.
But
Start with a sex robot and then end with a video.
but
I think John just made that up.
The point, yeah, it was him that said the sex robot. But the point is that we don't acknowledge that education, and when we don't pay for experience, we pay for the degree to some extent. I think that the inclusion portion of it, Crayons have always been all about financial health, but they haven't really found a good way to execute on it. I was talking to a Crayon the other day, one of our Innovation Club Crayons. They now have, I think, 21 high school branches. So they have the branches where the kids are actually running the branch and doing those sorts of things. But I'm still not sure that's not the way. We tried to crack the nut with the YouTube channel. Anytime that Crayons kind of try to show up in the kids' realm, like the Insta, like, hey guys, we're all Facebooking and Insta, we're kind of like, oh, we're going to move on now that the Crayon people are here. Let's start using TikTok because that's gross, So I think there's a unfortunate stubbornness. The last point I want to make about that you make, Chris, so you talk about the unbanked, right? You're talking about the people whose needs are being served. Have you seen Signature Bank and Silvergate? So
I'm aware of them, yeah. Yeah,
these are banks that they've like 10x their deposits and their scale by accepting crypto as an asset and lending on it. Why? Because there are so many people looking to use crypto that don't want to hit capital gains. So it's right back to what you said, but these banks figured that out and have gone, well, Silvergate started it, and then Signature's gone nuts. And I was talking about that with Crayons. I think it's an opportunity. Let's take another question if we can. Jonathan, do you want to go next, or does somebody else have one?
Go ahead, I can certainly, go next. And
if you have a question, please pop it in the chat if you want to be next.
I guess my question centers around.
Oh, by the way, tell them who you are.
Sorry. Yes. So Jonathan Silly from Hudson Valley Credit Union in Poughkeepsie, New York.
We sent him a shirt, but he refuses.
Yeah, I know. I'm never going to hear the end of that. So I guess my question is around the use of AI, and I think everybody's been talking about AI for quite a while now, and I think what we tend to see, and John, you sort of hinted at this early on in the conversation today, is it's pretty hit or miss if what people are calling AI is actually AI or just some interesting machine learning models, and they're not really truly learning, so to speak, on their own. I think we have a lot of that, honestly, that we do internally where it's machine learning, but we're not doing AI yet. Our vendors like to call it AI. I'm kind of curious to know, given where we are and all of the talk that's been around AI for the past decades, and the fact that I don't know that it's really come to fruition yet. I'm kind of curious to hear about how long people think it's going to take for true AI, something that can really learn and be practical in a financial services environment to be productized, turned into something viable, and then ultimately become disruptive more so than sort of a curiosity among financial institutions.
So,
Okay.
sorry, you go first, Chris, this time.
Okay. And I know you'll have a comment on what I'm about to say, because when I spent time with Alipay and Ant Group, the thing that really struck home for me was meeting the head of their systems architecture, who explained to me they were building their 5th generation systems architecture. So what that actually means is they reboot and regenerate their systems every 3 or 4 years. And I don't know of any bank that's regenerated their systems for the last 30 or 40 years, let alone every 3 or 4 years. And the 4th generation system was because of the scale of operation they now had to support. And I won't go through all the background detail, but basically they wanted to process 256,000 transactions a second with bulletproof confidence about the security of those transactions using AI. And so the artificial intelligence system that they built analyzes every transaction throughout the day and presents it in a visualization system that when you walk to their main reception internally, you can see it, but they won't allow you to photograph it because it's sensitive to their operations. And then last year on Singles Day, they processed 512,000 sales per second. And to me, it's just phenomenal scale with bulletproof intelligence. And that's where you learn AI. And there's a great book about the AI wars between Silicon Valley and China. And China, when Google Alpha, or rather AlphaGo, was built, woke up to the fact that Google and some of the Silicon Valley guys were doing AI in a way in which was far ahead of what anyone had believed before. And it's described in the book as a Sputnik moment. And if you remember, Sputnik was the Russian rocket that woke up JFK to say, we're going to put a man on the moon by 1969. That's what China's doing today. Brett.
So the area right now, as you've talked about with machine learning, it has there's areas where repetitive human process, particularly in sort of selection, where that applies to things like credit risk or fraud, identity theft, and so forth. We can track, for example, human behaviors, and we know that you're going to consistently make certain types of payments. And if suddenly you do one that's wildly outside of the parameters that we've seen historically for you, we can see that. So we can see certain behavioral elements. But right now, what's really interesting is in medical diagnosis. So it's estimated that the United States spends $750 billion a year on misdiagnosis of medical conditions. It results in the death of 20 to 40,000 people through misdiagnosis each year in the United States.
Wow.
So they're big numbers, not COVID big, but they're significant, right? The economic factor is the most concerning. But with diagnosis, for example, if you take a radiologist, an X-ray technician or an MRI technician or a CAT scan technician, and you give them artificial intelligence, they can do their job at a fraction of the cost in a fraction of the time with much greater accuracy than based on their own human skill set. And so that's the areas where we can get incredible efficiency gains in terms of the way we work, where there's humans doing robotic work, following processes, following a laid out steps, A, B, C, D. That's where machine learning right now is being very successful. There's nuances around like self-driving cars and things like that, because there's a lot of complexity. It's at the edges, the unpredictableness where those algorithms have issues. It's not, being able to keep a car in between the lines and stop at a traffic light and all those sort of basic elements. It's the edge cases. But where we can, if you can train another human to follow a process, we can train a machine. And that's really the core difference that AlphaGo has, or that deep learning model, backward propagation and all of that has given us, plus the improvement in sensors. So the improvement in camera technology, the improvement in ultrasonics, LiDAR detectors and so forth, all of those sensors have improved dramatically in terms of granularity. So computers can now recognize patterns in a way that they couldn't do 20 years ago. So you combine those two elements, and that's where you're getting that's where you'll get the big sea change. In areas like healthcare and finance, you're going to be talking about a lot of algorithms doing very specific things. To get to AGI, which you're talking about, a conversational, seemingly sentient, artificial intelligence, that is sort of essentially where we take all of those little bits of intelligence we've built in all of these different systems, voice recognition, image recognition, the ability to classify things. We put all of that together. We mesh all that up into the aggregate. That's how we're going to get artificial general intelligence. But we've got a lot of those components that we still need to work on before we can create that. And then there's a whole debate around consciousness and stuff as well, and quantum consciousness we could get into.
I want to throw that at Theo too, but just to build on a little bit. You think about RDC, right? That was the last revolutionary technology, in my opinion. I look at it like, I've said this before, evolution is products like bill pay that just sort of chug along. Revolution is if somebody's going to leave a financial institution to get that feature, whatever it is. But for RDC to take hold, a lot of things had to happen. We had to see cameras become ubiquitous in cell phones. We had to have the bandwidth to send those pictures. And so a couple of things are going on in the AI space. I've been very fortunate. I've been working with Ray Kurzweil directly for the last year. But thanks to Harry and what we've been working on, Brett, which I know you're aware of. And we've all agreed that AGI is a fantasy for a long time until we get quantum mechanics mastered in quantum computing. But what will happen is financial or what we're calling cascading AI, which means that there'll be a financial AI. We think we could get something smart enough to sort of inhabit that realm. But as it sort of tracks out, if, for example, you mentioned sensors, that's a big one, LiDAR being built into phones now, as we move into that space. But there's been another development I'm not sure you're aware of, Brett. We're partnering with Unity as well, and they just announced this. I actually have an article coming out in Wired. I can't wait to show it to you, where we talk about synthetic classifying. So right now, have you ever been to a site where pops up and says, "Are you a robot?" And it has you pick out all the fire hydrants because and by the way, I never do that right. I'm always failing at that. So the reason for that is because fire hydrants can be in different lighting, they can be in different snow, they can be in all over the place. What's happened now is we've realized that we can take a 3D model of something using that LiDAR that Brett mentioned. We can then put it into a synthetic situation, synthetically create all the different models of lighting, all this different stuff, and then add that to the classifier and make the classifier literally 110% better. So there are huge gains going on, but I still think we haven't come to the form factor for that. Theo, did you want to answer that, or you want to bring up your partner? Because Bradley wants to jump on. We have another celebrity, believe it or not, just lurking, another fintech celebrity lurking in our midst who had a question, and I think it speaks to this AI question. So I didn't know, Theo, if you want to take a crack at that or bring Bradley before we run out of time.
Nope, Mr. Lima can go for it.
Let's bring him up. Bradley, you there?
Yeah, can you hear me, John?
I can. Welcome to the show. Thank you for joining again.
You know, long time listener, first time caller. I just wanted to say hi to my friends here. Hey, Chris. Hey, Brett. Good to see you, Theo.
I have a quick funny story. The way I met you was you and I, but we're both commenting on some Twitter thread. I can't remember what it was at one of the Finnovations. And we're both like, what is this? You know, we're just back and forth. And that's kind of how I met you. You asked a great question. And I think it's really relative to AI because I think for credit unions to win in the AI space is going to require collaboration. So go ahead and ask that.
Yeah, so what I said was this. There are still almost 4,000 credit unions in the US. And, you know, I worked in credit unions for about a third of my career. So I do know a little bit of what I speak. 20 years ago, almost, I was at a NAFQ week-long thing for credit union executives. And I was, you know, at the end of the week, presenting with my team this idea that every single credit union should be connected. Every single credit union member should be connected, and every single balance sheet within the space should be connected in order to act as a foil against Wells Fargo, Chase, and everybody else. Actually deployed an awful lot of that when I was working in the space with the credit union that I was at, in terms of leveraging co-shared technology, leveraging co-shared development of tools and applications, and sharing balance sheets, frankly. So how can we get to a point, because every single person in this country is eligible to be a member of a credit union, to go past 1.8% membership growth? And how can we work so that credit unions can work together to not just serve the underserved, because I agree with the point that it is a very profitable place to play, but to serve every single person, because I think the credit unions are a better business model. Credit unions have the opportunity to do more in banking than what banks can do, because there's a different motive entirely. And so how can we get credit unions to work together and scale quicker? That's my question. Can I
answer that with a question? I just want to ask you this. So you've seen the Chime just growing like crazy, right?
Sure.
And their main claim to fame is that they'll give you your paycheck when it shows up in the ACH. I bet every credit union, I would be willing to bet 95, if not 100% of the credit unions on this call have been doing that for years, literally years, for their members. So why is Chime suddenly winning with that when they've all been doing it?
Maybe because they're better at marketing.
Shut up, Brett.
Better positioning. They're absolutely better
Bradley,
positioning.
softball. You're not helping.
So Chime and Vero and all these other banks are growing at, you know, millions of customers within the last couple of years, right? And so they're taking market share, and banks are paying attention. What's the difference? It is a little bit of branding. It is a little bit of marketing. It's a little bit of sizzle on the UX, but the value prop, if you can't sell your financial services value proposition and position it better than Amazon Prime or better than an app with a card attached to it, then you're in the wrong business. If we can't produce even the rate give back alone for credit unions on both the deposit side and the loan side, that alone should be something that they should be crowing about. So I don't buy that you can't bust through, you know, this sort of juggernaut. I do think it's a lot of positioning, but in terms of shared technology development, in terms of actual business model development to serve people in new ways, there's no reason, because credit unions actually work together really well. You know, I've sat in dozens of Radin conferences where people were like sharing their best practices, sharing how they actually change their balance sheets. So, you know, there's nothing but excuses for people not to work together more. But I want to hear from these guys.
Come to a close shortly, but I've got a view on this, and I'd be interested to hear any other views, including yours, Brad, which is, having presented at many conferences around the US attended by credit unions, I think that a lot of them are scared, a lot of them are small, a lot of them are worried, a lot of them are run by a chief executive who's been there too long and doesn't have the balls, because typically it's a man, to actually make the bold decisions to change the institution. And in particular, I think the issue is that they don't believe that they can stand up, because they look at the big banks and the big technology companies and the big players. They think that they all have budget, and you have to have big budget to compete. And they're completely wrong, because you don't need big budget to compete, not when everything is in the cloud with APIs. You just need to have good ideas and good innovations and good capabilities. It's the reason why Lending Club brought Radius Bank. You know, it's the reason why CWS has succeeded doing really good things across the US markets as a small Kansas City bank. You know, so a lot of it to me is incumbent attitude and poor management.
Would you say there's any relation to that, to the fact that most of the boards are not paid positions, and in banks and community banks they are?
I'm not sure. I mean, I don't think pay incentivizes people. I think worth incentivizes people. Feeling worthy and doing something worthy. It's nothing to do with remuneration.
It's back to your value. If you don't stand for something, you fall.
Exactly.
And I would just add in there really quickly that the board that I worked with for nearly 8 years was very, very committed to doing unique, innovative, and fast growing things to serve the membership. And so I think it's just a matter of the executives and the board working together. And more importantly, honestly, the executive teams working across, it's not even an aisle with credit unions. These are people that are like brothers and cousins and sisters. And, there's no excuse. We talk about credit unions a lot in this book. So go out and buy the book.
I was about to mention your book. Yep, Beyond Good from all of you. Well, we are right at time. And so I'm going to use this as
sorry, John. Was that Beyond Good by Brad Lima and Theo Lowe? I didn't spot who wrote that. Oh, wow. I got to buy that.
Yeah, Brad did something that I didn't do. He was pinging me, but yes, this is our labor of love right here.
Yeah.
Oh, you got one as well. I'm amazed. It's obviously
Yours
going
is
around
coming,
well.
Mr. Skinner.
Good work, guys.
It's coming. Thank you, Brad.
So as long as we're pitching books, I have just finished one with Kirk Drake on AI for credit unions. If you want to check it out, I did the forward on that. And we just we have a podcast coming out. But let's do this. Man, what a great team. What an incredible discussion. This will be turned into a podcast. Brett, I want to let you get to sleep. I know that you did
It
this.
is 3:30 a.m. in the morning here.
What an incredible way to celebrate a year of collaboration, to end it talking about, really kind of focusing on collaboration, because I do believe that's creating superpower. Such incredible thought here. Thank you all, really, from the bottom of my heart. Thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it. Buy these guys' books. They are required reading for my staff. And you'll find all the links out there. And thank you again, guys. Take care, everyone.
Have a great weekend, all.
Thank
Great
you.
program,
everybody.
John.
Bye.
Bye now.
Yep.